Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. I'm asking the question, is the next recession only months away? And the reason is because of something I have noticed looking at the history of recessions and rate cuts. Now, this is significant because of what took place a few weeks ago, which is that the Federal Reserve, for the first time since 2008, cut interest rates. 2008 was the last time we had a recession in which interest rates were cut, and this time the Federal Reserve has done what we have not seen since the last recession: cut interest rates back in July of 2019. But there is also fear that we are going to slide into a recession, and according to the people who purchase Fed funds futures, which is basically a form of wagering on the direction of monetary policy, you'll see that the people who are making these wagers show that they believe 100% chance of a September rate cut. Now, this is what gets my attention, and it's why I'm raising the question of it being only months from now before a recession hits. And that is that historically, rate cuts by the Fed and recessions are often separated by months, not years. Here's an example, and there's many of them. Rate cuts began in the last time before now that we had the Fed cut rates. They cut rates in the summer of 2007. The recession began in the winter of 2007. So we're talking months apart from when the Fed cut rates to when the recession began. Rate cuts in the recession before that began in the winter of 2001, and by the spring of that year, we saw a recession begin. Go to the recession before that. Rate cuts by the Fed began in spring of 1989. By the summer of 1990, America was in recession. Go back to the recession before that. The summer of 1981 is when rate cuts began, but it's also when the recession began. So if you go back before the 1990s, you'll start to notice that sometimes the Federal Reserve, in fact more often than not, the Federal Reserve tends to be late when it cuts rates. It tends to cut rates either at the time a recession is beginning or even afterwards, such as in the case of the 1980 recession, in which rate cuts began in the spring of 1980, but it wasn't until the winter of it was actually the winter of 1980, which was in January of that year, when rate cuts began. The recession began, I mean. And so it wasn't until months after the recession started when the Fed began cutting rates in that recession. Even worse, in the 70s, mid-70s, they cut rates in the summer of 1974, but it was in the winter of 1973 when the recession began. The main point is that the period of time between when the recession begins and when the Fed is cutting rates is not years long, it is months long. And all you have to do is look at the Federal Reserve's website, look at effective federal funds rate, and this blue line represents what interest rates have done according to the Federal Reserve over the past 60 years. And these gray bars symbolize recessions. And whenever the blue line is about to go down, a gray bar appears, meaning that a recession takes place only months after the Federal Reserve cuts rates. There are examples of that rule being defied, but for the most part, when the Fed is cutting rates, a recession has either begun or is going to begin within a few months. And this period of interest rates stretches all the way back to when the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913, and it goes all the way up until 1969. Once again, in the old days, the Federal Reserve was more likely to wait until a recession actually began before cutting rates. But in this modern age, they're trying to get ahead of everything. So they have started cutting rates before recessions, but only a few months, not years. And remember, they've cut rates already in July for the first time since the last recession. So we should expect, if history shows us consistency, which it has over the past century, the next recession will begin only months from now. Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be 12 months or 18 months? I don't know. But it will be, according to history, if it is consistent, months, not years away. And of course, you can go to the National Bureau of Economic Research to find out historically when recessions have begun, when they ended, and how much time there was in between each recession. One thing that is going to make this worse and perhaps speed up the onset of the recession is a trade war that began between America and China in the spring of 2018. And this all began with President Trump levying tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from China. This began in March of last year. The Chinese, within weeks, retaliated against those tariffs by levying tariffs against American imports of their own, focusing on agricultural imports, which is the reason why bailouts for American farmers began only months after the trade war between America and China began. The Trump administration was bailing out farmers with $12 billion back in as early as July of 2018. Keep in mind the trade war began in March. And only a few months later, farmers have lost so much money that they are getting taxpayer aid in the form of $12 billion from the government to prevent them from having to go into bankruptcy. The bailouts continued for farmers in 2019, and this time the aid package was increased, up from $12 billion to $16 billion. More aid for farmers who cannot sell their agricultural products to China because they have levied tariffs of their own in retaliation. President Trump promised more aid for farmers in 2020 if necessary as the Chinese trade war drags on, which it most likely will. President Trump is not giving an inch. He has levied more tariffs this summer since the trade war was launched in the spring of last year. And this has caused China to escalate even further. They're now not just levying tariffs, but they're also halting purchases of agricultural products completely, which is worse than a tariff, because at least with a tariff you sell less because your products are being made artificially more expensive. But to stop agricultural purchases means farmers will not be able to sell anything at all. This is the reason why the economy is also getting hit, not just from overall slow growth and people and businesses being maxed out in terms of debt, but the trade war has caused a lot of loss to American farmers. Back in 2017, about $20 billion of export revenue that farmers were getting. Now, as of 2018, it was down to $9 billion, and it is probably lower when the numbers come out for 2019. It will be most likely lower than $9 billion. So, in fact, Trump will almost certainly need to provide a multi-billion-dollar package to them that will exceed what he offered in 2019 if he's going to prevent farmers from going bankrupt. Another sign that a recession is very close is the mass layoffs of American workers and store closures that have begun in 2019. There are many of them, but I'll give a few. SpaceX, laying off hundreds of workers. Each one of these announcements of layoffs all came this year. Intel, laying off hundreds of workers across the U.S. and Costa Rica. Bed Bath & Beyond, set to close 40 stores. Oracle, cutting hundreds of jobs in Silicon Valley, and this in fact may be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to them cutting jobs, because worldwide they are trying to reduce capacity. U.S. Steel plans to temporarily lay off 200 workers in Michigan. In fact, temporarily may have to change into indefinitely, because as the trade war escalates and the economy slows down and eventually gets into a recession, those workers who have been laid off but told they may be able to come back may be told to just expect that you won't be back very soon. Walgreens, they're closing 200 stores across the United States. Lowe's is laying off thousands of workers, not hundreds, but thousands of workers, again, to do what all the other businesses are doing, reduce capacity, which costs money to maintain. And with a slow-growing economy and people who are maxed out, who have too much debt, can't get a loan, can't maintain their spending levels, they have to shrink the size of their production. Del Monte Foods closing 2 more U.S. plants, laying off hundreds of workers. There are many other examples, but the point is that we are seeing mass layoffs take place in 2019, along with a trade war and with the Federal Reserve having cut interest rates back in July. The manufacturing sector is in recession now. It is not going into one. It is already in one, according to the Federal Reserve's data. A recession is when you have 2 consecutive quarters, which is 3 months, of negative GDP growth. In the manufacturing sector, we had a decline of 2.2% in the second quarter after a 1.9% drop in the first 3 months of the year. So 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in the industrial sector means that industry is in recession. And what you have is individual industries going into recession before the entire economy goes into recession. This is the first time since the last recession that the manufacturing sector went into recession. So that's a warning light that's flashing. The Federal Reserve cutting rates is a warning light. The manufacturing sector going into recession is a warning light. And mass layoffs beginning, that is also a warning light. Unemployment rises sharply during recessions. And right now, it appears that unemployment is still very low. This blue line represents the unemployment rate. And the gray bars, again, represent recessions. Right now, we're at 3.7, 3.8%. And you may be saying, well, why isn't the unemployment rate rising if we have all these mass layoffs? Give it time. We will see the unemployment rate rise as more mass layoffs come down the road. And as people are unable to get employment after they've been laid off, the number of unemployed will stack up and it will start to push the unemployment rate up. One thing that we can say for sure is that no one knows the exact timing or duration or severity of the next recession until it happens. But the signs are there. Keep in mind, the Fed cut interest rates. When they cut interest rates, historically, a recession either is underway or will be underway in a matter of months, not years. So by the end of next year, we are going to be in recession if history is to remain even slightly consistent. And I have no reason to believe that it won't be. So what everyone should do is be prepared. Have whatever you think you might need that you don't have to survive a layoff, to survive lost income, lost wealth, a foreclosure that may take place, repossession of property, because the recession is coming and it will not be stopped. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel Libertarian Black Man and follow us on Twitter at Libertarian Black Man, and we hope to see you in the next video.